Hello.
Happy Thursday.
Oh, it's Thursday. Yeah. You too.
It's like the best part about Thursday is there's only one day left of the week, and then you get to relax.
We've been out of the loop too long. Could catch up on the agenda.
I left myself muted for all that, didn't I? I was just mentioning that I threw a bunch of stuff on the agenda, but feel free to throw other things that are more important in there. Derek, while we wait for other folks to show up, thinking through our conversation on the transactional API, is that something that would mitigate the concerns you have for pushing a artifact without a existing subject today? Or still concerned?
Where we left it the other day. I mean, I was thinking of it and similar to what you had posted about I'm not sure. I think I don't want to spend too much time discussing it here, but yeah, I think we should have another place we discuss it further or bounce ideas off. From my perspective, like, yeah, the transactional API as something lightweight, I think it makes sense to have that, but it's going to end up being something optional. So I don't know if it really changes the flow that much.
I was wondering if it made sense to put that into the non-existent subject P open issue, the 459, or if that would distract from that issue if we put it in there.
Maybe we should have another one. I feel like they're somewhat related, but not fully related. Like, I'm not sure that it really solves the problem for the next release, but maybe it could for 1.2.
Yeah, I think it's one possible way to address the mismatch of registry implementers versus client desires and possible workflows, but they're not one and the same. So I would probably suggest a new issue.
Okay. And then just kind of link the two so people can follow where some of the conversations move to. Cool. Well, I see Sajay here. I think we have all the votes needed if you want to do the tag and release and everything on RC5 now.
Okay, I'll take care of that today evening then. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. At least by my math, I could be off by one, so double check my numbers there, but I think everything is there for that. That was also counting people that were in the mailing list that weren't on the issue itself. Yeah. There was another one that I put out there that I don't think many people have looked at, which is the reverse absent header that lets registries communicate that you shouldn't be going out and doing a reverse listing on this image. And so I figure I'll put that out there, let folks know that that PR exists. Feel free to have a look at it, especially if you're a distribution spec maintainer, and give some thumbs up or thumbs down to that one. So that was just, I don't think anything for us to review here. We chatted about it a few times before, but I just want to make sure folks realize that one was sitting out there. And then I'll say pretty much where do folks want to take this, because I threw 4 different items on the agenda, but we can talk about those. We can talk about something completely different depending on what people are interested in chatting about today.
On the excuse me, on the non-existent subjects, we might be able to talk about whether or not the transactional API will work for Hub a little bit, since we do have Jeff here. Like Jeff, right before you joined, we were just talking about whether that should perhaps be on the same issue that Derek opened, 459, or a new one. And the takeaway there was a new one because it's one possible way to address some of the objections and problems there, but it's not, they're not intrinsically linked, and they're not, it's not the only way. But if we want to follow up on the theory of could this actually be a solution and a way to resolve an impasse, and whether or not it's part of this release or another release, keep that external, but just whether or not adding this would enable the validations and data integrity Hub wants, and Hub to enforce the rules it wants, while at the same time, allowing for people to do. I mean, I at least as far as I'm concerned, the primary case for it is still the atomic upload of I don't want any content to be live and observable by a client of the registry until I'm happy that all of the content I want to push is also available, or will be available even.
To put a little context around our discussion earlier in the Slack, or maybe to summarize it a bit, I think the concern about pushing the subject before the manifest that the subject extends, so the artifact before the upstream image, the concern that I was hearing from Hub was that that left kind of like some dangling references there that you didn't want. And the proposal that we were putting out there in the Slack was to say, what if we had a automatic transactional API? And so the clients wouldn't necessarily be expected to do that right away, but it'll be good if they did. And the transaction that you can set on would just be a field that says, hey, I'm doing a transaction based off of this digest. And as soon as the registry sees that digest has been pushed up, it knows that, okay, that transaction is done. And the thing that we could make an automatic transaction on would just be whatever the value of the subject is. And so that way, whenever you push something that's got a subject and the target that it references doesn't exist yet, the registry could kind of do some kind of quasi-automatic conversion to a transactional API. That would probably be a little bit Hub specific. I don't think it's the best option in the world, but I think it is better than the option of rejecting everything. So I wanted to propose that as maybe a method to get the impasse through there. Go ahead, Jesse.
Sorry, I remember we talked about this a while back, the thread that's referred to, and I was just, so for us, it's like we do garbage collection. So, and we have lifecycle policies. So one of the ways that we trigger on that is if the subject manifest is deleted, then we delete the artifacts. So I think the transactional API might be interesting. We also can revisit how we're dealing with lifecycle policy and garbage collection. But I think what I'm interested in is this is a good conversation to have. Is this in context for 1.1, or would this be something where we have to make a decision and leave a door open for future work? Like I think that's interesting to me, just because I want to know sort of if, like, kind of how spicy this is, like how important this is. And if we should be like kind of leaning toward like a solution rather than, design.
I think the big debate we've been having in the issue is do we leave it as a must and know that Hub won't support that, but might have a way they could kind of get some kind of support in there? Or do we make it a may and then later on add the transaction and Hub could allow that to be a must in the future? And
Yeah.
the way I've been kind of pushing towards to say, let's keep it as a must in our spec. And so the spec would remain unchanged, but that Hub could do a little something on their side that worked around the fact that clients are going to start pushing stuff out of order. And so 1.1 would remain unchanged. 1.2 would add maybe a formal, this is a proper transactional API that everybody could use if they wanted to. And then Hub could just do their thing of where it's not quite within the spec, but it is probably covering all the clients that are implementing the spec in a way that they would not break.
Yeah, I mean, I think at least in my head, like the technical side, like, is this possible and would this make everybody happy is more important than the timing one. Which one does it go in? But I mean, I can certainly see wanting to invert that, because I think that is the question, is that do you release 1.1 knowing that it'll create some fragmentation with a large registry not being able to fully support the spec, like supporting it 99% of the way, but diverging on one specific point and being out of conformance, and especially the spec language being strong and potentially, you know, nudging people to build clients on that assumption that registries will, you know, if they otherwise are observably 1.1 conformant, follow the spec? Or do you risk blowing up the 1.1 release, which, you know, is almost in a state that everybody's happy with, except for a couple things that are still missing and a couple finer points like this, you know, with an indefinite timeline for creating a transactional API everybody's happy with. And two big registries too. I guess that's an interesting data point, is there another big registry that cannot support the language as is? Because we've been talking about Hub. Okay, so ECR actually cannot conform with the must. ECR requires the subject to be present during upload.
So I was actually in favor of when I saw Derek's suggestion to remove the must, but I think you just nailed what I was trying to drive at, but much more explicitly, which is I don't want to blow up the release. I don't want to blow up the train we're on. And, you know, frankly, ECR nor Docker Hub are 100% spec compliant now. So I can live with being a little out of spec, especially if I document it. That's fine. And I think it's fine for our customers. And so I think, you know, kind of taking that hat off and saying, what do I think as someone, you know, contributing this conversation for the spec, I would kind of just lean toward the path of least resistance, especially if we're thinking about something to innovate around this in a future release, you know, and they have this like a transactional API idea or other things that we can kind of noodle on. That I think would be I just would say that publicly that ECR will not support this, because I think at scale it would be very difficult for us to modify how we effectively you know, do collection orphan layer collection and how we're going to drive LCP, that, you know, the core lifecycle policy feature in the registry.
I mean, I think that's exactly, you know, you're saying exactly what I've heard with regard to Hub, of like, I don't know the technical details. Like for you, it's related to your GC and lifecycle. As with Hub, I understand it's more the core data model, and how the backend is architected. But I think it is really helpful, at least to hear that from another registry implementer, just because, I mean, one, it helps validate my concern that it's a significant burden on registry implementers, especially at larger scale. But two, you know, it's also good to know that just in general, you know, it's not in a vacuum. Right. I imagine ECR might have some of the challenges of Hub, and that I think you support many more tags than some other registries do. Because like the Hub has repositories with 100,000 tags that are heavily trafficked, is my understanding of where some of the pain points come from.
Yeah, exactly. But like I said, I think I'm okay with that, right? I mean, there are, and you know, we sort of have this ongoing you know, project to march closer and closer to OCI compliance. I don't think that we're missing on anything major. We don't have like an open source tool is going to break working with us, right? It's things like this where it's like and that kind of indicates to me that maybe it's not a must, right? Like if tools can generally work and most things don't break, maybe it's a should. I don't know. But
And ultimately, it's a little bit of like, where do you point the finger? You know, because the reality is that things are going to work in the 90% case, and 10% of the time it's going to be hard to debug. And where does the finger get pointed? I think.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
But it's also very helpful to like to even like that you know, to hear that you feel that way, you know, because it's also more confidence. Like if we do just go ahead with it, you know, I mean, I think this is where I cannot speak for Docker and collectively, but you know, I do think that it wouldn't be the end of the world for us either. Like it'd be a really unfortunate situation, and if we can avoid it trivially, but also, you know, I don't think the world would be on fire or anything. So I mean, that's my personal read though. So it's very much like would have to do more shopping around to get a definitive opinion there. But
and I would say without one, I think we would just keep sort of as Brandon had indicated, just keep sailing in the direction we're sailing. Right. I mean, if we can't find a definitive pushback, then I wouldn't say let's wait for one. Let's, you know.
I'm kind of the representative person that's been doing the pushback, and so from the
You are? Oh,
I am.
I thought you preferred the existing language as it is.
I do.
Oh, so you know, I meant
backing.
I meant pushback in the form of Derek's issue of saying we should change this, right? Like let's push back on how the language is. I think the language right now as it is, we let it sail unless somebody yells, right?
And the must is new, so it's a little confusing. It is a recent change.
Yes,
yes.
It did go in November. Yeah,
it's in RC. Yeah. It's been in for a while. It's RC3.
Been in for about a year.
Yeah,
humorously, I think Derek was the one that was the maintainer that approved it.
Relatively recent.
Yeah, we've been doing this a while.
Certainly since 1.0, it was a change. Yes.
Hey, I make mistakes all the time, and then I say, you know what, that wasn't a good idea. So
yeah.
I don't take my approval to mean much, and I don't think anyone else should either.
I was looking back and I'm like, wait a minute, he's the one that approved this. And I just kind of laughed.
I also approved it, but that, you know, did one thinking about it.
I back out my own pull requests all the time. So
yeah.
So Jesse, I'm curious because I haven't seen you weigh in on the Slack thread that we were talking about this. Would having some kind of transactional API help in the ECR case as well?
I mean, like I said, I just showed up today and I'm like, I got some catching up to do. I've just been in some other stuff. It sounds interesting to me. It's certainly something where, and that's sort of I would prefer we pursue what is best for the specification, not the timeline. So I agree with Bjorn, but also I would say, I don't want to blow up the timeline. If it's a thing where we're going to be thinking big picture, get in a room with a whiteboard, think about how this might work in the future, I would lean that way. And in that case, yeah, we'll be in the room and we'll see how we can make it work. Like I said, and a couple people joined late, I think like fundamentally, like one of the problems for us here is that we're managing a lot of content at scale for a lot of customers. And so we have, a feature with policy, lifecycle policy. One of the ways that we will clean up artifacts, you can have, hundreds of artifacts pointing at an image that you delete. If you delete that manifest, we'll come through and clean up what is effectively the orphan artifacts. If we allow you to push over a non-determinate amount of time, some number of artifacts referring to something that doesn't yet exist, we might come in and delete them, right? And so that's going to be our problem, is that we will have to then figure out, well, is this part of a transaction or not? Well, if there's a way to indicate that, then we can say, well, don't delete those. So I think that absolutely would be something that we'd be interested in contributing to the thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, the design we were thinking of to make a transaction was to say, what if we just use a manifest digest as our transaction ID? And I think Bjorn was thinking earlier, let's have like a start transaction and an end transaction, some kind of little API that we were going back and forth with. And I was saying, well, we can automate a lot of this client side where the client knows what the digest of the manifest that's going to end this is, hopefully, if it's building a transaction, a bunch of stuff that it's doing. And so that's unique. It's something that can be easily generated client side. And then we run with that as the header that says, hey, I'm running a transaction with this is my end goal here of this manifest getting uploaded. And if we do that, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I realize that there's a very widely used, I mean, it doesn't support pushing manifests today, or sorry, pushing artifacts today. So, maybe this is somewhat of a non-issue, but it is worth noting that one of the very largely used clients, specifically the Docker daemon, with the default storage implementation, does not know the digest of any content it's going to push before it pushes it. I had this realization a little late, doing some unrelated work related to digest handling. Specifically, like this isn't a world where, say, that there's something built into BuildKit or similar that's going to attach artifacts to a push, and you want to push it all using the Docker daemon. It's not going to work today. It could work tomorrow with the containerd storage integration we're working on. So I don't think it's a huge deal at all. That's why I didn't mention it. But yeah, I mean, just wanted to point out that the biggest implementation doesn't actually know what the digest is.
That's right. Yeah, and that's
but for the things we were thinking of having a digest or a transaction on, we were thinking of stuff like artifacts where you need to know that manifest digest to put that as a subject in your other manifest.
Well, and that has the problem of like it's not going to support a digest first flow anyway, because you don't know that, so you can't push the referrers ahead of the subject. But
in Docker today.
Yeah, like architecturally that would be impossible. So that, like I said, it's somewhat of a non-issue, but just worth noting when we're talking about like kind of the digest is free to use as a transaction key.
Okay, fair point. So
yeah, I think that's what we brought up on the last thread, right? Like the last time and I don't remember, Brandon, like when we last talked about this, it was some months back. And that was sort of like my issue. And I do know that there's other use cases, but like the primary use case here is that like we're going to compute that digest when you push the image manifest anyhow. So it's a little bit contrived, but I do understand that there are some use cases that aren't in that path.
Yeah. And for the users that are pushing stuff out of order, so I'm going to qualify my scenario, and that way I can eliminate all the Docker concerns like this. For the users that are pushing stuff out of order and they're pushing the signature and other stuff ahead of time, they will know the digest of the thing they were signing because they needed that in the first place. And so because they've got that, they're going to have that in the subject field already. So if we were to consider that as the transaction unique ID, maybe you can have some other unique ID in there. We'll figure that out later on. If we were to consider that, the thing we were proposing in the Slack thread was, what if the registry, when it sees one of these subjects pushed ahead of time, the artifact pushed ahead of time that it doesn't have the upstream manifest for, what if it did this whole quasi automatically converting it into a transaction push? Because then we can say we can push this stuff out of order, but now that we're, whatever the transaction API would have given us before, we've got this way that we can say this in this little quarantine area right now. Maybe the thing we're breaking is that people couldn't pull that right away. But we're getting into that state where in the GC scenario and stuff like that, we know that, okay, it's in its own little spot here that if they don't finish this transaction up, we can just wipe the whole area and not worry about it.
So what are you thinking? A response header saying, yes, okay, but
so
it's in a transaction?
The automatic transaction concept here, which is not OCI at all, it's just how registries can get around this scenario of clients push stuff out of order, is that they would look at that subject field and say, I haven't seen that digest for that manifest already. I'm going to reject it.
But without
rejecting
communication to the client saying that you're in a transaction.
That's the complicated part, is that I don't know that we've got that because we haven't defined this yet. And so that's where I'm saying
you could do a response header coming back saying, okay, we'll accept it in a transaction. But that would be
so there's a couple things to unpack there, I think. The first one, I think, is just on the concept of keying a transaction to a final push of a specific digest. I think it works here, and especially we're thinking about designing this to to solve this particular challenge. But I guess, I just want to make the note that it's not maximally generic. There are clients that don't know their digest ahead of time, and so it excludes them. I don't know that's necessarily problematic, but just wanting to acknowledge that. I think that the concept of the automatic transaction, like that, is almost a bit fraught, and I wouldn't want to get hung up on it too much. At least to me, that seems like exactly like a kind of hack that a registry might implement to use the same logic, because essentially, I mean, you wouldn't need a transaction to do that. That could just be that, like, what does the word accept mean? If must accept means like must return a 200 response and hold the data, but I mean, I make no promises that I'll still have it in 15 minutes according to some arbitrary registry internal rules. Like that's because the must accept there essentially implies that it must be retained indefinitely. It must be treated. I mean, GC and life cycles aren't part of the spec, but I'm interpreting the must accept there as like must treat it like any other valid piece of data that will be retained, that will be kept live and retained like normal, and
Like
not
normal.
like if I treat it, if I push this without a subject, treat it the same as if I push this without a subject is basically how I interpret that. And again, this is getting outside the spec, but like technically that's something like, if that's something Hub was willing to do, that is something that, yeah, you could do today. In a world where you don't hold yourself to that standard of must treat it like something with a subject. We special case things with a subject.
We may be in violent agreement, because today you can garbage collect stuff whenever you want to garbage collect it, and the spec says nothing about it. So I would not be offended if you did something like that. I would think for the end user use case there of thinking that it's usually nice if you give them time to finish their push, that would be good. And if you delete it 15 minutes later because it took them that too long to do the push, that might not be so bad.
I mean, this is where, like, I mean, I feel like this is one of those out of band expectations things, though, that's just outside the spec, and certain people have a mental picture. Like you have a mental picture, I have a mental picture of like what people are doing, how they're interacting with us, and those can be wildly in disagreement, or we can make assumptions that are outside the language of the spec and let those leak into opinions on the spec. Like I'm kind of thinking of that, your do a head on the tag to determine if the digest is there, and then I know I have the content, but that only works if you know that all the referrers should have been there the very first time you ever saw that digest. Right? Like,
yeah, for me, when I say you must accept it, I never said how long you had to keep it.
I mean, in that case, we can say we accepted it and then literally drop it if there's no matching reference and we're technically in spec. But
you can pass the performance test.
If you have something that you truly want to say, we need this to be uploaded in this order, and we're not going to rely on what well-behaved clients or some arbitrary agreement on what correct order is versus incorrect order, then it needs to be codified in such a way that it's written. Right now we're trying to imply social agreement order on top of an arbitrary spec, and so if we want this to be done in some specific order, then we need to codify it in such a way that it's a specific order.
Well, and to be fair here, like I'm slightly, like I'm the one slightly tainting the conversation there, because like that's one particular use case Brandon has in mind, but I don't think it's a mainstream one, and I think it's a slightly dangerous optimization. I think the bigger issue is just the general case, like Sajay was talking about last week, is that I don't want my content to be live until I'm satisfied that some arbitrary number of referrers that I want to be visible when the content is first pushed are also live. And that I think is the thing to focus on, is the 99% use case that, I don't want this content to go live until all the referrers are live. And yes, I could push them after, but presumably for purposes of debuggability or end user support, like we had the Docker official images team mention this internally, that is something that they like, that would be preferred to have that ability. And so then in that world, like, my thought on the idea of a transactional API is that it could support what Hub wants, because Hub wants to be able to prevent dangling vertices. And maintain data integrity. If you have all of the content and you can do a solve essentially and make sure that your graph is closed at a particular point in time before the content goes live, but not necessarily like if you can do it at a point in time instead of having to do it continuously, that I think would offer some of those properties. I mean, the idea of you do that at the time that you commit a transaction instead of at the time that something is pushed to the staging area on the registry, a world where you had transactions.
I mean, how long today do you wait when you see a layer blob uploaded before you say, yeah, no waste 22, let me delete it? That's kind of the thought process I go through. And so I would hope not immediately as soon as the layer is pushed, but it's not indefinitely sitting up there forever. I think I see Jeff chatting about some of that stuff, saying, is it, an indefinite dangling pointer that's going to sit there forever? And I'm hoping that the conversation here is saying, no, not indefinite. But
well, I mean, that's I don't think like a string and then it becomes a live ref makes any sense. I mean, it is always a reference. Like if we like, it's saying you just link it later is, I mean, exactly what it says today. Like, okay, something was pushed. I need to check all the things that have subjects that are in this repository and see if any of them should be linked to this thing. Okay, now I can connect that vertex in my graph, or, I can add that foreign key relationship in my database table so that when somebody hits the refers API for this content, it's not a very slow query. But that requires you to, be looking at all incoming pushes or to run some cron task in the background, which won't 100% correlate. So you probably do need to be doing that in incoming pushes. Like it's, I think, a different way to say what is in the spec today.
when I think of the speed of the query, I feel like you would need to index on those subject fields to be able to efficiently look it up. But I don't necessarily think that you need to link them to a manifest to make it a quick query. I think that's an implementation decision. I'm not saying you can't make that decision, but I'm just saying that I think that's a decision that you made that's kind of putting you into that corner there.
I mean, I think that's also getting a little too hung up on like Hub has their specific implementation. But like in the case of ECR, having not the same technical root cause, but something that, challenges with lifecycle management there and back-end design that are similarly hard to solve on a short-term time scale, but also from a technical standpoint, completely unrelated as to the root is a good data point.
I think getting into the implementation details is an interesting one. I mean, in a perfect world where we all had, extra time to redesign everything the way that we would love for them to be done, this wouldn't be a problem. But the fact is that there are implementation details, there are, tech debt items, or the way that things were decided upon years ago that, when some of these changes come along, it does make them harder to implement. Some things are easier, some things are harder. And so while yes, we can kind of write it off of, hey, we don't need to do that as an implementation detail, that does in the real world get in the way of what things are feasible and not within certain timelines.
Trying to figure out if we've come to a conclusion here or not. I don't know if we have.
I mean, I'm kind of thinking that it makes sense to either say that, like, maybe Jesse's right, and the thing to focus on is just the timeline of like, we know that some people aren't going to be able to conform to this. We know it's going to cause problems for some registry authors. Do you ship it as is? And clients might have to deal with a little bit of fragmentation, or you might have to figure out how to create useful error messages and, have maybe some plan in mind for unwinding that situation in a future version of the spec? Or, is it worth delaying to try to figure this out holistically.
What direction are you thinking of for the failure case in there? Are you thinking of, are you leaning towards saying we're just going to reject these from the server side, or are you thinking that you'll throw them into a small quarantine for a little while? What path are you going toward?
I could say that for us, it's if we don't reject it, then it goes into quarantine with a TTL. So I don't know if that's ideal, right? When you push it and we say 200, we got you, boo, and then some number of hours later we come along and delete it. Probably not ideal. So I think we would probably have to reject it.
I'm honestly on your first case, so you say it's not ideal. It sounds like a good solution to me.
Well,
I think
that
you
would
get
be
around that by
there's the
I
life
think-
cycle problem, I think, right? Like
that's what I'm talking about.
if you're trying to
It's-
wire
yeah.
up like a GC ref, you have this content there. Okay, I mean, I guess it bounds the amount of content to however much somebody can push in, say, 15 minutes in a 15-minute rolling window. But you're having to check everything that's in that quarantine and try to wire it up and make it live, or, you know, before you throw it away. Like, it's not good enough to say that, like, okay, after 15 minutes, we're going to check that the subject is present and then we'll wire things up, because you want your refers to go live immediately. You don't want them not to show up in the refers API for the first 15 minutes.
I should have asked the question, who do you think it's not ideal for, Jesse?
I just think, you know, I think it would be a surprising behavior, right? What we're saying is that, and again, I think we've called out maybe humorously that maybe the spec doesn't define persistence, right? Like, we must accept something and give you a 200. We can put it in a bit bucket. I think the spirit of the spec says don't do that. So, you know, the idea of us accepting content, giving you back a 200 and saying we got that, it persists, and then it disappears, you know, 24 hours later is
That's going to be
surprising.
a lot of support tickets, I would predict,
I
about,
would think so.
And-
Yeah.
you know,
My-
why are
my
you
favorite
throwing away my
registry is
content? Your
TTL.sh.
registry is defective.
Yep. Exactly. And there's, you know, there's always corner cases and contrived, you know, what if somebody, you know, hand types a digest in and they have a, you know, a typo, right? So, you know, I mean, I think the safer thing to do for the customer experience, the user experience there, would be to fail it. And like I said, I don't really have a problem with that. I think Docker Hub will end up doing the same thing.
As a user,
And you
I
know,
would
these are
suggest-
two. Go ahead, Brandon.
I was gonna say, as a user, I would say the otherwise. It would feel better to me to accept it and then to automatically GC it, but to
Oh, you won't be
document
happy
what your
then.
GC policy is.
Yes.
Do-
Like I said, I think
Document
if
that
we
to the
do
users, and
this,
so the users know
yes.
when I'm pushing here, this is what
Yes.
will get deleted automatically.
Well, I mean,
yes,
as long
that's
as
part of this.
this goes back to my theory that as long as there's a mismatch here between expectations from clients and registries, or there's some disagreement on, you know, exactly what can be supported, what guarantees can be made, it's really just where do you point the finger? Because like that one is like you point the finger at the registry's policies, or, you know, do you point the finger at the spec? But the fundamental issue is like the misalignment between registry implementers and client implementers, and what kind of breakage do you have with 1.1 is really just like, you know, who you want to get blamed.
Yeah, I mean, and I think documentation goes a long way to resolving that. I do want to say, kind of for posterity's sake, like I think that the need for must in this stanza is kind of a fairly contrived use case. I do. So I'm not super passionate about saying that, yeah, registry should, must, whatever. I think that it's unlikely, but it could happen. And so back to sort of the original point about, you know, two of the biggest registries here are also two of the oldest, right? You know, ECR predates the OCI spec in toto. So the fact is that there are pieces of the specification that we don't, you know, we don't comply to. Nothing major, but it is there. So I think if the question, and if we bring timeline into it, if the question is, should we carry forward and just get this settled and then revisit the idea of a transactional API or something else in the future, I think that we would support that. I'm fine with that. And Michael just came on camera. I don't know if he has something to contribute.
I just think in every other situation, when we see a descriptor, we validate that it exists. And so we should do the same with subject.
Right. So layer descriptors come in, there's a digest, we verify you already pushed it, it's there, it's in place before we accept that manifest, which refers to it. Right.
Yeah.
That does make
Manifest
sense to me.
lists.
Yep.
Or
Yes,
indexes or
exactly.
whatever, we're going to validate that the manifest that it refers to exists. And so same with subject, like, I don't know, if you're pushing, like, I think having a defined order and not saying like clients can do whatever they want makes things easier to reason about, instead of having some clients do it in one order. Like Docker is going to push the image first because they need to know the digest, and then some other tool is going to push the references first because they have some other idea. Like I think that's harder to reason about. And so having it, like, I actually think we should, all registries should or must validate the subject exists. But we should
So
at
for
least allow it to
for the
happen.
tools out there like me that are written poorly, that are doing a recursive copy of an image and all the different refers and whatnot, are you comfortable with getting pinged on the registry every polling cycle for every single manifest on every single tag?
Yeah. That's, I mean, that's what, isn't that what you would do when you're pushing an image? You would check, does the layer exist? And then you would push the layer if it doesn't.
I would do a head request against the
Yeah.
manifest on the source and a head request on the manifest on the target. And if they match, I say I'm done. That's what I want to do. But if I don't say should, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to recursively go through every single tag and every single manifest, including all the multi-platform, pull every single manifest, and then do a recursive query of all the refers for that.
Yeah.
Well, but you have to
do that
do
either
that.
way.
Unless you know the uploader, unless the uploader pinky promises to
Right.
you that I
Yes.
solemnly swear that I will make all the referrers live before you can observe my tag.
You shouldn't build a client that relies on a transaction that isn't actually enforced, right?
I mean, right now, it's a flag
Eventually
the end user
consistent.
turns on.
Like,
Yeah.
some
Yeah,
other
right.
person could have uploaded part of it. Like maybe another client, maybe they're using your client and some other client that is lazier than your client and doesn't copy everything.
Right now, it is not a flag that's on by default, but is a flag that someone can turn on.
Yeah.
And if they can turn it on because they know their scenario, it makes things significantly more performant and reduces a lot of the load on the registry.
I mean, at least with regard to rate limits, like my understanding is that they're somewhat of a non-issue in that the rate limits only apply to getting the manifest itself and how many times. Like
Once per
it's
polling cycle per manifest in a multi-platform list. Which means
does
if you have
anything
a
change
repo with a dozen images and each one of those dozen images has 10 platforms that's in there, I hit the rate limit just in that one repo.
I mean, in some ways, I mean, I know I called out before of I do want to separate the rate limit issue. I do want to call out that rate limits are, and I don't want to say flexible, but like as use cases change, as registries grow, as hey, we're storing more artifacts instead of just images, or we're doing whatever. We can adjust, we can update, we can do whatever. I would say, I don't know. I don't know how to correctly frame this from a Docker Hub side of things. But I would say if there is something that you are hammering that much and trying not to pay for it, maybe you should pay for it. Which I know is an uncommon thing, but I would say, head limits are, unchecked. And so like if you strictly are just checking if something exists, that's not really an issue on that front. but also kind of getting into, hey, it'd be nice to, I know there's been some internal discussions on formalizing update APIs or type of things where it's more of a subscription of things that are updated, so we don't have to just continually long pull. But I would say, specifically speaking to Docker Hub, the amount of other usage that's kind of garbage probably dwarfs any of this. And so I would say the issue of trying to not overload registries is probably not a concern.
Oh, looks like we might have lost Jeff there. I guess I'll sync up with you, Brandon, like what your client behavior looks like. Because the thing I was trying to think about is like there's no rate limit on the refers API, and the manifest is returned as part of a manifest list.
So I have to pull
So,
the manifest list.
or no, sorry, you have to pull the manifest that's in that list. Okay, yeah.
And then I have to pull each one of the child manifests to see, do they have something in there? I mean, I can proactively try to do ahead, but then if it's a list, I have to query it on every one of the things in that refers list. I'm also recursively checking those as well. It turns into a lot of API calls.
I'm just slightly remembering a discussion earlier from the containerd call of, if I use an optimization on the overlay snapshotter that doesn't rely on the kernel to enforce consistency, it's faster 95% of the time, but 5% of the time I end up in this really awful state where, because I don't have those consistency guarantees, I'm making assumptions, things blow up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just kind of the same spirit of like, it feels like the kind of optimization, which is really tempting, but is potentially a foot gun. But
it's one that I
Yeah.
leave it for the users to turn on, because my assumption is if they turn it on, they know something about the source, where the source is promised, I'm only going to push signed images. And so, every one of my images is already going to be signed, so you can pull it. And if they get something that's not signed, well, they can say, oh, hey, something's broken our mirror. Let's go ahead and fix it up with an updated copy. And those kick off a one-off to fix their one broken copy, while the normal synchronization is doing it for every other image is consistently quick. And I'm looking for that low impact on registries whenever I can. So I don't want to pull away from other topics there. I saw Sajay saying something about there was a desire for the compatibility spec discussion to happen.
I don't think that made it on the agenda. And there's still a lot of comments flying back and forth on that TOB issue. Like, I haven't fully had time to read, so maybe that one can wait a little bit, but there are the other ones we could try to get through.
Yeah, I think we can wait with the discussion a little bit, because there are still some comments, as Bjorn said, so.
I think all the items on the agenda are me throwing them in here in the 10 minutes before the meeting, so they are not critical.
Well, if we're not, so if we're not moving on, then I mean, what's the resolution on 459? Like that's kind of what I want, because we just talked for a long time and then we're just going to get off the call. So like, where I started, and I think where Bjorn was as well, is like, I think, I'm in support of the proposal that Derek made in 459. I think it makes more sense. I think that the arguments against it, while real, are a little bit corner and maybe contrived. And I don't mean that in a negative, belittling way. I just mean that they're very specific. So I would be okay with this. What I don't want to do, and to make it timeline wise, like, I know that's maybe not the only priority, but I really don't want to reset the clock yet again. Like, and I feel like it shouldn't, but then, weeks go by with the next RC. So, I mean, I feel like if this forces a rev on the RC, okay, I guess that's fine. But I'm also okay with it, with us kind of just dealing with it. and honestly not complying to it. So I think I just would like to know kind of where others are, what we think kind of as a group, what should we be doing here?
I
Is it-
feel like I'm
yeah.
the one detractor mostly because I'm the one person that's written the implementation that does a full recursive image copy with refers. I'm pushing
Well, I-
Oris to get there
I
today.
know on. Well, I know that there's other people using artifacts who want this. I think. I mean, I think this is a similar situation to like me bringing it up and Derek writing the issue of like,
There's
it's just
we
one
do-
person who's
Yeah,
advocating for it.
exactly,
But
yeah. But there's other full recursive copies. Like Crane does recursive copies, Scopio does recursive copies. They just
They'll do
don't
a recursive copy of an image, not of all the refers to the image,
They
and the refers
do
use refers.
with all the refers too. Yeah, so
Oris
if you
does
do like
not.
oh, fine. I mean, so Scopio does, right? And others will. Like, I mean, I think the thing is that they copy the image, then the refers versus the refers, then the image.
I'll have to check Scopio.
Yeah.
I know Oris does not. I don't think Crane does refers yet.
Oris,
they're waiting
I thought
for us to GA.
Oris does too. Oris
I
CP
thought
-R.
Oris
Oris has a flag.
Oris,
That flag
Yeah.
only copies the refers on the manifest that you specifically copied, and then the child manifest, it does not touch any refers on.
oh, you
if
mean
you
it doesn't
run-
copy the refers of the refers?
Doesn't
It
copy
doesn't
the-
copy the refers on any of the child manifest.
If you do a manifest list copy, it'll copy the refers to the manifest list and then the child images, but not the refers to the child images. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Which
if
sounds
you
like
do
a
a
bug.
multi-platform list, it will copy the refers on the manifest list. It will not copy any of the refers on the Linux AMD 64 image, the Linux ARM
So like a
64
deep,
image,
like
any of
a
those
deep
platforms do it.
recursive. It sounds like a bug.
I've
I mean,
queried to
I mean,
them
it
to
sounds
see
like a
if I
bug
can-
versus intent, right? Like, because that's an implementation of something. And again, this is a specification that specifies registry behavior and client interaction. So I think if we say that registries may refuse, a refer with a subject manifest does not yet exist, then that client implementation needs to change to be spec compliant, right? Like, I feel like we sometimes do this where we look at existing, sometimes in-flight RC-based implementations and go, we should make the spec apply to that client implementation, where I think the flip side of this is really what we should be looking at. What is the distribution specification best practice? And
where I was
in
going with
that
that, though?
context, okay, all right.
Yeah. Where I was going with that was that if Oris had done the full deep copy, they might be in here saying, yeah, we don't want to do that either.
I don't think they would. I mean, it's hard to speak for them, but I don't think that the presence of these child images should be enough to assume that their refers are also there.
It's just because
You
of the
have
time
to
that
do
it
the
adds.
check anyways.
It adds a lot of overhead, and if you get
I
into
know.
a whole repository of that, it adds a whole lot of overhead.
But
it's
that's the truth of like the tree can be big. And there's not like, I don't relying on the existence of what the primary manifest or the primary image to tell you that all of the refers were also copied just doesn't seem like it is good enough to design a spec around. Like,
I guess there's also the question to me of like, if this is just a premature optimization in the sense that how are people using referrers today? Because I mean, I think there's been extensive discussion at various points, both like people who are looking at implementing referrers, like how can I use this, as well as what should be supported. Like, you can tie yourself into knots with, weird circular arrangements, and like you can draw the graph lots of different ways because it's just an arbitrary pointer. But I don't think that like a deep tree is hopefully at this point not something that any real tool is make or break for them. Like in terms of like what content people are actually pushing, is deeply recursive content something that is realistic?
So today you can say I want to do a cosine sign of an image and all the child images, and so it would add a signature on every one of those manifest.
For sure. Or I mean, even something more direct, like you could build SBOMs for each of your images and sign them all, and then push a manifest list or OCI index, right? So, I mean, I think there's good use cases for this. I think what Michael said is kind of more what I align with is you shouldn't assume, you know, that, you know, because of the existence of, say, that OCI index, you shouldn't assume that everything's in place. I mean, I think also that might be just a hole in this as a specification, right? And you know, we can get into the nuance of like whether this is a spec or an RFC or even worse than that. Who cares, right? Like we're basically building registries against the intent and the spirit of the specification. And what I guess my argument is not over rotating or prematurely optimizing, like Bjorn called out, right, for a client implementation. I do understand the gap. I totally get it. And Brandon, you're right. But I don't know, of the two choices, right? I think I would lean toward what 459 proposed. Or 459, sorry. Like what Derek proposed. And I think I said that back when we discussed it months back. And I was like, I don't really get this, but now, you know, when it's kind of coming time to us building it, it's going to be a problem. And, you know, if there's a trade-off to make and I can say, yeah, every client's going to need this, other registries need this, that's cool. What I'm hearing is that kind of two of the larger registries on the planet will have a problem implementing it.
Yeah, I'm hearing the same. So the concern to me is it is on the efficiency side. And when I hear the Quay group coming to us saying, hey, we're getting hammered with just the tag listing API, I'm thinking, yeah, wait until I hit you next.
Oh, so do I. So yeah, we do too. We get like a billion and a half hits a week on that thing, on public. And, you know, I think Quay is bigger than ACR public for sure. So
yeah. But
it does get hammered.
But I mean, the fact that if someone listing all the tags, if that's not enough for them, they now want to say, okay, now I'm going to recursively query every one of the manifests that every one of those tags has referenced in there and everyone that refers to it.
Yep.
Your load is going to exponentially increase.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Should we take this back to the issue? I'm loath to get off of this. I think this was a very productive conversation, and I would love for us to be like, yes, we've decided a thing. And I realize that that might not be realistic.
My personal thought was maybe because this is there's somebody's going to be cut one way or another. Like my thought was maybe just throw it to a vote on the mailing list. I mean, you know, I'm not a maintainer, but ultimately there's pros and cons. There's going to be fingers pointed one way or another. There's, you know, it's just, it's not great and it's going to take time to resolve. But if we just, you know, want to do something now, make a decision, I mean, just asking for a quorum and just rolling with the punches, failing forward strikes me as, you know, the pragmatic solution from a time basis.
Yeah, we linked to the previous vote. We can do another one of those if we think it's anew. We're revisiting that, so makes sense.
Well, thanks. Are we wrapping up? We're probably wrapping up. Are you guys just talking in the chat now? Okay. All right. I'm gonna drop.
I don't think we've got to. I don't think we have enough time to debate everything. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just getting back to the old, like you wouldn't need this API if you just put it in the manifest. But.
Yeah. Sajay just linked, RC5. Where are we at with image RC5?
He just released it.
He just released it. Thanks. There we go.
Nice work there, Sajay. Thank you.
Sajay's a hero.
Like I'm just getting things done while this discussion winds down.
He's the one person making progress in this whole meeting.
Not all heroes wear capes. Thanks, bud.
This whole conversation, I'm remembering it from 5 years ago when we talked about the index and search APIs. We had the same problem then. We ended up not having one, and that was the answer.
Also, Mike, do you recall compatibility? That was the thing we didn't get to on the agenda. Remember that months-long conversation? Yeah. Yeah, so Marcin, we will
Yes.
get there.
Yep.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. It's good to see everybody. Thanks for the conversation.
Thanks all.
Cheers.
See you.